So just yeah, sort of to dive into things. I've read your book and various other accounts that mention kind of how you started to become interested in the Franklin expedition, during your university years when you read the McClintock account of the search that was sent to the Arctic on behalf of Lady Jane Franklin. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about kind of what aspects of the expedition caught your attention initially and kind of what you thought you could bring to the task of solving this mystery.
Well, I always say that I wasn't really interested in Franklin, really. I'm sure I was taught about him in high school. And even when I picked up the McClintock book, I didn't know it was about Franklin. I thought it was Conrad-esque fiction. But in those days, my two preoccupations were sailing and scuba diving. And I did, because the Great Lakes, where I live in Ontario, don't have coral, I ended up being a wreck diver because fresh water and cold water preserves wooden wrecks perfectly. So I had been searching and diving on old wrecks for a couple of years by then. And like every wreck diver, I wanted to find one of my own that no one else had found. And when I read the McClintock book and there was a latitude and longitude of where the ships had been abandoned, I said, well, this is going to be easy. Nobody's found these. They seem to be significant. I just have to go dig a hole through the ice, drop down, and there they will be. I soon got into researching it because I'd say wrecks are always found in the library. They're never found in reality. The clues come from the library. So I started doing my research, in my spare time. I didn't get very far until I realized that the only way I was going to find out where either of Franklin's wrecks really was, because they weren't going to be where they were abandoned in the pack ice, was to listen to the witnesses, the Inuit.
So just yeah, sort of to dive into things. I've read your book and various other accounts that mention kind of how you started to become interested in the Franklin expedition, during your university years when you read the McClintock account of the search that was sent to the Arctic on behalf of Lady Jane Franklin. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about kind of what aspects of the expedition caught your attention initially and kind of what you thought you could bring to the task of solving this mystery.
Well, I always say that I wasn't really interested in Franklin, really. I'm sure I was taught about him in high school. And even when I picked up the McClintock book, I didn't know it was about Franklin. I thought it was Conrad-esque fiction. But in those days, my two preoccupations were sailing and scuba diving. And I did, because the Great Lakes, where I live in Ontario, don't have coral, I ended up being a wreck diver because fresh water and cold water preserves wooden wrecks perfectly. So I had been searching and diving on old wrecks for a couple of years by then. And like every wreck diver, I wanted to find one of my own that no one else had found. And when I read the McClintock book and there was a latitude and longitude of where the ships had been abandoned, I said, well, this is going to be easy. Nobody's found these. They seem to be significant. I just have to go dig a hole through the ice, drop down, and there they will be. I soon got into researching it because I'd say wrecks are always found in the library. They're never found in reality. The clues come from the library. So I started doing my research, in my spare time. I didn't get very far until I realized that the only way I was going to find out where either of Franklin's wrecks really was, because they weren't going to be where they were abandoned in the pack ice, was to listen to the witnesses, the Inuit, who had some indications, gave us some clues as to where to go. And so that developed into my bias of being the Inuit tradition whisperer, the one who was paying attention to the Inuit traditions when most others discounted them, and working towards that. Eventually, after about 5 or 6 years of my research, I still wasn't thinking of writing a book. I was only thinking about finding a shipwreck. One of the people I was interviewing asked how hard this was, and I said, well, it is hard. I have to go to all these places. I have to go to the British Museum. I have to go to Scott Polar Research and spend a week there. I have to go down to the Smithsonian for a week. I'm a young naval officer with a family. I don't have the finances to do all this. It's getting quite difficult. So what I'm doing is I'm keeping all my notes, and I will make them into a compendium that some future researcher doesn't have to come and do all this work. They can just, get my notes, and they'll have all the Inuit stories collected in one place. And that's what the book initially started out as, was a compendium of Inuit stories. But as you read through them, you realize that there is a way to connect them. There is a thread that you can, well, actually many threads that you could draw through them. And so I made up this narrative and put it in my filing cabinet, still hoping to go up and do a rec search. And of my 9 trips to the Arctic, 7 of them were looking for the wreck. The other 2 were looking for Franklin's grave, basically because that's what my sponsors wanted me to do. But yeah, I was totally focused on the wreck through the whole thing. So once the wreck was found, my contribution was pretty much over.
Got it. And then, you just talked about how for so long this Inuit testimony has really been ignored. And, you were one of the first to really say this is where the answers lie. Could you talk a bit more about kind of the reasons that this Inuit testimony was ignored for so long?
Well, I mean, I'm surmising here, but for the first century, it was partially, racism. British imperialists did not put much credit in the Inuit stories because they were, as I think Charles Dickens said, bawling savages, the babbling of savages. And they're not easy to unravel. You've read the book, so you know that they're quite often conflated. They sometimes have shamanistic inputs and magical and supernatural elements to them. So, although I do have the reputation of taking every Inuit story at face value, I don't think that's really deserved. My bias was that they were excellent observers. They had to be to live in the Arctic in those days, and even now. You have to know if you're sending your grandson out to fetch caribou from a cairn you made 2 years ago, you have to give him pretty good directions, which means you have to have been observant. You go to this black rock, and then you turn to the right, and then you go another day, and you'll find a lake, and near that lake there's an Inukshuk, and then you go another day towards where the sun sets, and you'll find my cairn. So they have to be observant, just as part of their culture. They also are observant because of the strangeness of the white men. It would be as if aliens landed in your backyard. You would pay attention to the details. So when they talk about things like something soft, some stone that was soft and then became hard, that's not something they were familiar with, but we call it mortar or cement. When they talk about a white man with a boat that held wind that he carried on his shoulders, they're talking about what we would call an inflatable boat. Well, there were only 3 inflatable boats in the world when Franklin sailed, and they had all been made by the same guy, a lieutenant named Halkett, who had just invented them. And most Europeans would never have seen one or heard of one. So if an Inuit saw it, you can be sure he saw it. So there was almost always a diagnostic detail, is what I call it, in the Inuit stories. And if you put all the diagnostic details together, you could get a narrative. You could get many narratives. And my first manuscript, I was rejected by the publisher because I had too many caveats in it, saying that this story could mean this, or it could mean that, or could be connected to this, or could be connected to that. And she quite rightly says, there's no reader's going to follow you through all that. You just pick the one narrative thread that you like best and abandon all the rest, and you can put those in footnotes or another book or whatever. And to publish a book, that was right. That was a good thing, though it irritated the heck out of me. So anyway, that's how it happened. It was all very unplanned. I started off to make a compendium. Once I started doing that, I realized I could make a narrative. Even then, it spent 2 years in a filing cabinet in my basement because I didn't think it was very good. And then my wife, one of the authors I interviewed said, when you come to publish, look in your bibliography. Whoever the publisher is that shows up the most is the one you submit your manuscript to, because they're obviously interested in what you're interested in. And I told my wife that trick, and she found out that McGill Queen's University Press showed up more often than anybody else in my bibliography. And I was, at the time, I was still a mariner. That's my professional life. I've been a mariner my whole life. So she said, next time you go to sea, I'm just going to package up the manuscript and send it to McGill Queen's. So I know she does what she says. That's kind of the woman I'm married to, and I love it. But so under that threat, I fired it off to McGill Queen's, and it was accepted. So that's how I became a published author. I never really went through the normal routine of rejection after rejection or after rejection. I wouldn't do that. So um, everything in even my Arctic trips, except for the first one, which I planned. I was still in the military, and I used my military connections to do that one. But after that, seemingly once you've had one successful trip, you're known in the expedition community, and I got offers of sponsorship, and I always had something I wanted to look at. So if someone was going to offer me enough money to basically pay for the trip, I would gladly go to the Arctic for anybody. So it turned out that I went up 9 times.
And then I think, you talk about this in your book a little, and I think you also reference this in, your comments just now, but could you talk about some of, I guess, like the challenges associated with researching this Inuit testimony? For example, the fact that some of the stories could apply to both, like the Ross expedition as well as Franklin's and things like that.
Well, yes, because I mean, a British exploration team in the mid 18 or 1900s, whether it was Ross or even Perry, was going to look quite similar. Each of those expeditions would look quite similar to an observer. They came in wooden ships. There were a lot of men. They wore the same uniforms. They ate the same food. They basically did the same things. So I do not assume that every story I hear it was Franklin. In fact, what I used to use was a filter saying, first of all, I had to go into the research of the Perry and the Ross expeditions in much more detail than I had expected. But if something could apply to them, there had to be a detail in there that could not apply to them to make it into a possible Franklin story. For instance, there's an Inuit tradition about a large hunt of caribou, that the men and the Inuit went out and killed so many caribou it made a line of blood on the ice, which is a very telling detail, to drag all the bodies of the caribou back. Well, Perry did not hunt caribou, and Ross did not hunt caribou. So if that is a valid memory, and like I say, there's a lot of remembered detail about it, then it must apply to Franklin. By default, it's the old Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark scenario. So using that filter, a lot of things were geographically specific. The Inuit are also very good at geography in their own way. They know their land so well, again, because they need to use it, and they use the same land for generations. So they know where the landmarks are. And if they say that something happened at Two Fingers, Tit-or-Tat, which is called Two Fingers, which we now know as Smith and Grant Point, then we can be pretty certain that they're talking about a Franklin story, not a Ross story. He never went there, and certainly not a Perry story. There are ways into the stories. There are some stories that are obviously conflated. Some stories where Ross details and non-Ross details show up in the same story. Mm-hmm. So, and you would expect that too. Like all stories, like even our stories. My stories about my grandfather, when I interviewed my dad about my grandfather, I had the wrong idea about him. I'd just got the wrong impression, or somebody had said something that I took the wrong way. And so this is just normal in the storytelling process.
And then this one's it's definitely a big question, and I know this is something that you outlined thoroughly in your book, but I wonder kind of if you could summarize just sort of briefly what your kind of theory is about what happened to the Franklin expedition, based on the Inuit testimony and other sources.
Oh yeah, that's not a big question at all. Okay, well, first of all, let me preface it that it's all speculation. Everything about Franklin is still speculation, even though we found his ships. So all I can claim is that at least it's partially informed speculation. And it has changed, just like a scientific theory. You get more data, you get more details, and if you don't modify your theory, then it's not really a theory. So initially, when the book was published, excuse me, I thought the ships had been abandoned, as we know, in 1848. The men had marched south, and that they got to Two Grave Bay, which is just not very far away, because I walked that land with just a backpack, and I know how hard it is. And I walked it with like 3 companions, and we only made good a few miles a day. So I did not think 105 men would get very far in 30 days, which is as much food as they could carry. Mm-hmm. So apparently now there have been so many discoveries in Erebus Bay, a little farther south, that now I think that they actually made it to Erebus Bay. The reason I didn't think they made it to Erebus Bay was that the Inuits talked about the second ship, the one that was found, the Terror, in Terror Bay. as being close to shore and being a lot of interaction. And the Inuit also stopped looking for Franklin material to the north of Erebus Bay originally. Everything north of Erebus Bay, they didn't know anything about it. It was there for McClintock to find in pristine fashion, and but anything south of Erebus Bay had Inuit interaction. They visited the camps and they had stories about them. So I thought that the ships had been remanned in 1848 and taken south in whenever late 1848 or early 49, 50 to Erebus Bay, which had all the hallmarks that some of the stories had. It was close to shore. They were close to shore. They established a camp, and the interactions could take place there. That made more sense to me. The Erebus Bay is directly south of where the ships were. I also knew there had been a camp in Terror Bay, but I thought it was unlikely that the ships would have made it that far because you actually have to go south, and then you have to go east, and then you have to go north. That's not the way the ships usually move in the ice, and not the way the ice opens up. So, in retrospect, finding the Terror in Terror Bay has changed that whole part of my book. I now discount that as having been overtaken by evidence, and that Erebus Bay is where they ended up in 1848, and a lot of them died. We know at least 23, I think. They're up to 23 casual individuals died there, which is a significant part. That's 25% of the crew who had abandoned are now dead there. So, and that the ships were remanded. There's so much evidence the ships were remanded. It seems impossible to me that they were not remanded. We can go into that later, and then they were taken to Terror Bay, and so that's the biggest modification. After Terror Bay, a small group were sent east along the south shore of King William Island, and they were met on the march, 25 maybe men. They probably are their remains are scattered along the south shore of King William Island and on the Todd Islets. You have to know your geography and to follow this. And only one ship ended up in Terror Bay. Now, whether the Erebus actually accompanied her to Terror Bay or it went a separate way, separated by the ice stream or by the crew's decision or whatever, it ended up far away in Erebus Bay. Eventually, that ship was abandoned and they tried to walk off as well, probably fewer of them, 10 maybe. And they went along the north shore of the Adelaide Peninsula, totally different route. They left companions in camps there, and most of them died at what we now call Starvation Cove. The bodies at Starvation Cove were found under an overturned boat, and I don't think the last dead man pulled the boat over them. Even a few of them probably survived that and wandered on. And there is a story on the Boothia Peninsula that 4 of them were found by Inuit and nursed through the winter. One of them died of a sickness during the winter, and then they were headed south. And there are other stories on the Melville Peninsula about wandering white men who could have come from either party, who were headed for Igloolik, which is another place they knew that Inuit could help them, but they didn't make it either.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very helpful kind of overview of everything. Let's see. And then kind of going back to your research in your book, I wonder if you could talk a bit about kind of the reaction to its publication and its kind of emphasis on Inuit testimony and how that kind of, I guess, shift in focus sort of influenced the wider conversation about the Franklin expedition.
Well, to show how little impact I thought it would have, one of my ambitions, I had 2 ambitions for the book. One was that I might make enough money to take my daughters to Disneyland. And the other was that sometime before I died, it would be mentioned in a footnote or a bibliography. That was it. So I was overwhelmed. I did make enough money initially to take my daughters to Disneyland. And immediately there seemed to be a lot of interest in this new focus. I'm not sure how new it was. When I read Ray and McClintock's book, I can see a lot of things that are ideas that they suggested that I think I just fleshed out a little bit, especially when I read Syriax's book, which is hard to find, 1939, which I still think is pretty much the Bible on Franklin. I blush at how much I copied him, that I didn't even realize I was copying him. I read it originally, and then I read it again when my wife bought me a copy a few years ago, and I'm going, oh, I stole that idea. I don't think I ever credited him with that. So I didn't think there was much original in the book at all. Like I say, it was a compendium of Inuit stories that were in the stacks, spread around the British Isles and in America, and some in Canada, that few people had access to, and were had not really been utilized very much. People were always using the same Inuit stories, usually the ones that had been pre-selected because they were sort of amenable to the reconstruction they wanted to make. So I was quite, I didn't get totally good reviews. When it was peer reviewed, it was sent to two people. One thought it was great and one thought it was horrible. So they sent it off to a referee who thought it was okay. And so I got published. But, and even the commercial reviews, the public reviews have not been fantastic, but not all fantastic. Some of them are good. I think the one that I would put on my wall was really good, except he called me Woodward all the way through. Couldn't get my name right. So I don't know how seriously you can take a reviewer who can't get your name right. Otherwise, it was excellent. So I'm always amazed. I'm amazed when people actually know who I am. I just went to a conference, and I won't say I was mobbed, but almost everyone there knew me and read my book and asked me to sign their copies and stuff. And it just blows me away because it's such a minor footnote to what is now a minor story.
And then earlier you talked about how you actually went out to the Arctic to search for both the wrecks of the ship and Franklin's grave. Could you talk a bit about kind of what it was like just being in that unforgiving Arctic environment and kind of retracing the steps that these men took?
First of all, it made me realize how much of an armchair historian I was. I'd made a lot of assumptions about how far people could travel, how easy it would be. I found out that nothing in the Arctic is easy. Putting on your boots can take 20 minutes to a half an hour. So, yes, it is unforgiving, but it is also surprisingly and amazingly beautiful. The sun does not set in the summer. It just goes around the horizon in a circle. It gets a little higher at noon and a little lower at midnight, but the light is amazing. The landscape without any vegetation except lichen can be very boring because in my section of the Arctic is very flat. Other sections are absolutely stupendous geography. But it also is like I say, I'm a mariner. It's almost like being at sea. The horizon is long. You get the feeling that nobody else has ever been there. If you walk 20 feet from your tent and you can't turn your back on it, you could be standing on a part of the planet that no other feet have ever touched, which is an amazing thing. You're so far away from everyone. You got to remember, I did my expeditions from the mid 90s to the early 00s. So even GPS was fairly new when we started. You're thousands of miles from your family. It's 40 degrees below sometimes. I've slept in caribou skins in an igloo, which was amazing. I made friends as much as you can make friends with my Inuit guides, who were all amazingly competent and helpful and cheerful and wonderful people. So yeah, I loved it up there. I must admit, I would always tell my wife, "Well, I got to go up again," but secretly I'm going, I'm going up again. This is great. And every time I went up, I thought it was the last time. Almost every expedition had a different sponsors, different focus, and came as a surprise to me that I'd been invited, or except for the last few that I actually had a chance to organize. So all in all, like, I'm sitting in my office now, and half of it is my maritime career, including my Navy career, and the other half is all Franklin. So I guess it was a big part of my life.
Let's see. And then some sort of, I guess, bigger overarching questions. What would you say are kind of some of the most persistent myths or misconceptions surrounding the Franklin expedition?
Oh, well, there's two, I guess. One is the standard thought that since the Victory Point record says they abandoned the ships in 1848 and that everyone had abandoned them, that they must have all died in 1848. This is the standard reconstruction that has emerged in the 19th century and is still carried on, and that they just marched in a certain line and ended up at Starvation Cove. And I think there is so much evidence, including evidence in my book, but others have done the same, that proves that could not possibly be right. But people who just dip into the story, they find that reconstruction, it's an easy one to understand, and they perpetuate it as if it was fact. The other one is the lead poisoning theory, which again has been debunked by scientists and food experts and everyone else over the last few years, and it still appears. If you get a standard magazine journalist treatment, and I understand journalists cannot spend 3 years researching stories and usually use secondary sources, that one gets perpetuated as well. Very few people. If I had a chief of police once who was a good friend of mine, and he said that if a sentence starts with "everybody knows," then whatever follows that is undoubtedly wrong. And so everybody
Yeah.
knows about lead poisoning, and
Mhm.
they were all crazy. They had lead in them, and they wandered around and crazily and died. And that was the reason the Franklin expedition failed. I think that reflects more on our own modern preoccupation with poisoning and toxins and the environment. The evidence shows that they had no more lead in them than the people they left behind in England. In some cases less, and there was no evidence at all that it affected them in the way that is usually portrayed. So anyway, those are the two main myths about Franklin.
Mhm.
But as I say, almost everything is speculation. So I quite often get crazy ideas sent to me by enthusiasts, and I always try and take them seriously. There
Mhm.
might be something in there. Sometimes they are easily debunked with a few facts, but a lot of the times I go, well, yeah, you could be right.
Mhm.
Who am I to say it?
Mhm. And I think that segues well into a question I had about, obviously the two really major points in recent history are the discoveries of Erebus and Terror. But there's also, academic studies and research that continues to come out. For example, in 2024, the study that identified the remains of James Fitzjames. And so I guess I was wondering, kind of given the fact that we have found the wrecks and there's still all of this research, what are some of kind of the biggest mysteries that still remain or kind of future avenues of research that you think would be really valuable to pursue?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, the discovery that of James Fitzjames's jawbone at Erebus Bay sort of solidified the idea that I'd already talked about, that that must have been the terminus of the 1848 abandonment. I can't imagine him being there and not buried. Whether he was subject to cannibalism or not is still open to question, because there's not a lot of meat on a jawbone, and the scrapes on the right side of his jawbone could be from other things. So, when I wrote my book, only 4 bodies at Erebus Bay had been identified. So it could easily have, and they were in and near the boat. It could easily have been that they'd left behind one boatload somewhere along the line, either still heading south or heading back to the ships. Now there's 23, including a captain. So
Mhm.
that sort of reinforces the idea that that was the terminus of 1848. The discovery of the Terror in Terror Bay. As soon as I found that, I was very surprised. But then I immediately went back to all the Inuit stories about how they interacted with the white men, and the ship was close to shore, and there was a camp ashore. And I'd already known there was a camp ashore at Terror Bay. There was one at Erebus Bay too. And that they'd been buried on a little mountain on a hill. There are no hills in Erebus Bay, but there are in Terror Bay. And I'm going, oh, that was so obvious in hindsight that that's what they were talking about. So that helps. Erebus itself, where it was found, was about. I always say I have a bias on my shipwrecks of being too far north. In both cases, I was 10 miles too far north than where I thought the ships would be found. It's a little more surprising. I didn't think it would be in that shallow water. Um, so far, the divers have not got to major discoveries that impact the story. I mean, they're finding amazing things, but the ones that are to be remaining are the stories say that there was a body inside when it was found by the Inuit. It had been abandoned. One big man in the back part of the ship. Unfortunately, the back part of the Erebus, the after stern, is the only part that's been significantly damaged by ice. So if they find human remains, skeletal remains underneath all the debris there, that would back up that Inuit story and confirm that the ships have been remanned, because all 105 had abandoned it, according to the only document we have. The Terror, as well, is in better condition. It's deeper, and so it's going to be later in excavation or investigation inside. It'll be interesting to find out how much coal they had left. The propeller on the Terror is in place, but the rudder is missing. That's very confusing. Propeller being in place is a big clue. You wouldn't have left the propeller in place when the ships were abandoned in back ice. It was a weak point, and it wasn't that hard to retract. It was intentionally designed to be easy to retract without having to go outside the ship. Just pulled it up in a well. So it makes it, again, pretty likely that the Terror had been remanned and had somehow made its way to some open water at some time, so that they were trying to use their steam engine and propeller to get where they wanted to go. The Erebus has an ice anchor 24 meters off its side. Again, an ice anchor, if it had been deployed on the ice in 1848 where the ships were abandoned, would not have survived all of the trip through the pack ice and the jostling and everything to get to where the Erebus sank. So it's more likely it was deployed by humans when the ship had arrived in the 1 year ice where the Erebus was found. So bit by bit by bit, each piece of evidence brings us a little closer. I always say it's like looking at a kaleidoscope or looking at one of those optometrists' vision testers. Every time they make a change, is this better? How about this? Is this better? How about this? Each time is like dropping one of those lenses. The story is very
Perfect.
fuzzy,
Yeah.
but every piece of information we get is like dropping one set of lenses and going, oh yeah, that's better. I can make more sense out of it. I always said that if we ever found the ships, we would just sit there with our head in our hands going, that's what they meant. Because we were the interpreters. They meant what they meant. When they said the ship was to the west, they really meant southwest. But if you learn about Inuit geography, you realize that that's what west means to them, because they use the prevailing wind of the northwest as north. They said they had to walk 3 miles out on ice, but that means probably that the ship was still attached to the shore by 3 miles of shore ice, and that's so totally possible. So it was our problems of interpretation. They were good enough to lead us to the right large search area. They weren't good enough to specify it. They were essential but insufficient in us locating the wreck. It still took years and years and years of long, patient, difficult work to actually locate the Erebus. So you got to give credit to those guys who spent the days and days and days in small bouncing boats with sonars behind it, looking at the screen of the flat bottom going by. I have done that, so I know it's not the easiest thing to do. Anyway, so to your question, how we advanced? Those three things, there's still things to learn. If we find food on board, the Inuit say they weren't starving, that they were sick. I think and they say that when they found the Erebus, there were still unopened tins of food on board. So that will be interesting, because we can test those tins to see if put the nail in the coffin of the lead poisoning theory, I think. And also we'll pose the question, why are there still food tins on board? Which it's pretty obvious, because you can only take a month's worth of food on a sled. That's all you could take. It's all anybody ever took. So if they had reduced their numbers by attrition to a few, you probably couldn't take all the food you had on board. Even specialists, the internet's been a great thing, because the internet brings in a lot of people who are specialists in things that I am not, and that's a lot of things. One was the very curious fact that at the Erebus base site, there was 10 or 40 pounds of chocolate was the only food left. And being an aficionado of chocolate myself, I was going, why didn't they take the chocolate? Like wherever they went, why didn't they take the chocolate? And then I came across an expert in the Royal Navy victualling who said that was probably a couple blocks, probably 4 blocks of 10 pounds each. And the chocolate they're talking about was basically hard as a brick. And you chipped it off and made chips out of it, and then you put it in the boiling water for cocoa. Basically, it was their morning drink. But it wasn't the kind of, it wasn't Hershey's bars or whatever that was easy to use. And so if they had left the cooking material behind, or had found out it's so much work to make a fire, which it is, then they probably didn't need the chocolate. The chocolate was like our coffee. It's great to have, but you can survive without it. And I'm going, I would never have known that. Without the internet, I would never have known that. And it's just a nice little detail. Same sort of thing happens with people who investigate old rifles or know a lot about heraldry. And there's a button that was spoken of at my last conference that they don't even know if it came from Franklin. It's said by the person who found it and donated it to the museum that his relatives always said it was from Franklin. But you can look at the details of a brass button and actually date it by the style, if you know about brass buttons in the Royal Navy. And there are people out there who do. So bit by bit, I follow the literature, and I'm amazed by the insights that come from people just like me, most of them amateurs, who have a passion for this.
Great. And then one sort of last big question, but what would you say has kind of accounted for the fact that so many people have been captivated by this expedition, from the beginning and just over the 180 or so years since the ship set out?
Well, first of all, it's a great story. Like
Mhm.
it's a fundamental story, man against nature. In this case, nature wins. Um, the heroic aspect has faded over time. We no longer think about these guys as heroes, which is probably fair. They were basically military officers doing their job. That's what they were. They weren't
Mhm.
heroes. And military sailors doing their job. Most of them. Most of them were quite young. They, I think that besides the fact that it's a great story in total, it was fundamental to the discovery of the Arctic, which is a big deal for Canada because of sovereignty and our foundational history. We don't have a civil war or a revolution or even a Wild West to fall back on. So discovery of the Arctic is a big deal for Canada. It sort of takes that place, that and the
Mhm.
Mounties.
Mhm.
So it is well known in Canada. The fact that it's a mystery, I think, has made it worldwide. It's captivating because we don't know the answers. Jeffrey Dahmer killed more people than Jack the Ripper, but we know everything we want to know, more than we want to know about Jeffrey Dahmer, and we don't know who Jack the Ripper was. So that makes Jack the Ripper much more interesting to us, and he spawns a lot more books, even though it was in the past. As an objective thing, like 129 men lost is not great tragedy. We lose that many in airline crashes or other natural disasters or sadly man-made disasters all the time. 129 individuals is a tragedy for their families and for themselves, of course, but it's not a world-shaking event normally. But it
Mhm.
inspired the exploration for the next couple decades in the same way that if Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin had disappeared behind the backside of the moon and never reappeared, that would have been such a big story for us. This was such a big story for the Victorians. The Victorians were just fascinated for decades and decades about Franklin.
Mhm.
So there are all these things. The modern work and the fact that we're starting to get more clues since the technology has caught up. We had to wait for the invention of GPS and sonars and things to have any chance of finding the wrecks. You couldn't, as one of my friends said, I wasn't going to dig a hole in the ice and put my head through it and see if there was a ship there. We had to wait for a lot of technology to catch up, which it has only recently done, and more is coming. We're learning more by forensics. We've identified two individuals, including Fitzjames, by their DNA and their descendants. So, you know, I'm an old man now, but when I was young, DNA was not heard of. GPS was never heard of. I remember taking a sat phone on one of my trips, and it was like $5 a minute. So now you can do it anytime you want. So the
Mhm.
world is helping us to slowly unravel this mystery, and I think that helps to keep it topical every time somebody finds something.
Mhm. Great. Yeah. Then I think those are the questions that I had. But well, first we're gonna ask whether you had anything you wanted to add.
I mean, research is difficult. You have to go through a lot of material that is not relevant to what you want to find nuggets, and that can take a long time. But it's also so rewarding because, and this includes Smithsonian, who were very good to me with the Hall papers. You're treated so well, and the people who work in these institutions are very happy to help, very knowledgeable about what they have. They're almost universally great people. When I first went to the Maritime Museum, the Greenwich Maritime Museum, I was a naval officer serving with the British Navy on exchange at the time. So I was a 21-year old. I went there in my jeans and t-shirt to see the Franklin exhibits, and it was just a very small case. I'd expected, in my own bias, that Franklin would be like half the museum, and it was a very small bookcase type thing with a few items that I'd seen before or heard about, but not nearly anything I want, all the things I wanted to see. And I was approached by this, middle-aged lady who could see that I was standing there for a long time, but didn't look very happy. And she said, "Well, is there any way I can help?" And I told her, "Well, I thought the Pegler papers would be here, and I thought, you know, there'd be, a can or something. And, this is a very small display. She says, well, we have so much. You can only display so much. But if you would like to see the rest, come with me. And it turned out that she was Anne Shirley, who writes as Anne Savers, and she was the administrator in the museum. And she took me into the back room, and suddenly I had the Victory Point record in my hands and the
Oh
Pegler
my
papers
gosh.
and all this stuff. She had no idea. I was just a teenager to her, right? But
Mhm.
this was wonderful.
Yeah, that sounds like an incredible experience. Lucky you ran into her.
Yeah, because I could easily have just gone with disgust, turned around and walked away. Um,
Mhm.
so, yeah,
Yeah.
all the people I met. I remember Harold Langley at Smithsonian was excellent to me, got me in a little office and set me up. He let me come in early with the cleaners and leave late with the cleaners. So I had the whole day in that little airless office going through the hall papers. Um, there's so many people who helped me along the way.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like a really great community. And like you mentioned, the power of the internet, just people with all these different kind of niche specialties has been really valuable, it seems like. Yeah, so then I think that's everything that I had. But I really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. This has been so helpful. My story is going to go up on our website probably on May 19th for the actual anniversary.
Right?
But I will share a link to the story once it's live, and I will email you this recording after we wrap up.
Fantastic.
Appreciate it. All
All
right.
right.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you for calling.
Thanks. Bye.